Okay, it might be helpful if I show how some of the models were represented visually. So this was the simplest version of the multi-store. The information comes in from sensory stores into a short-term store, then into long-term memory through rehearsal. That was elaborated by Atkinson and Schifrin, and they talked rather more about the details of the short-term store and proposed that it acts as a temporary working memory. We found that their model was too simple and elaborated it into a three-component model: a central executive, that's an attentional controller, a phonological loop that cycles information around, hence the little arrows, and a visuospatial sketchpad, which we assumed transferred information in parallel, hence the double arrows there. Individual components generated further complex models, and this is one generated of the phonological store by a neuropsychologist based on the phonological model, linking in with brain damage. And I don't need to go into it in detail, but it illustrates the fact that you can unpack these simple models and that these components in turn can be unpacked. So it's part of quite a complex system. Our simple model had to be complicated a bit when we discovered that the phonological loop was useful for learning language, and so we added a link between the phonological loop and long-term memory, the shaded area, so-called crystallized systems, long-term systems, and the unshaded are temporary, so-called fluid systems. We know that the phonological loop helps you learn language, and we also know that language helps with the phonological loop. We assume something similar with the visuospatial sketchpad, but it's not really been investigated very much. When we proposed an episodic buffer, we assumed that it depended on the central executive and that it accessed long-term memory. We didn't want to add further arrows if we didn't need to, and we decided that we would try and test the model by interfering with each of these separately and together. When we did that, we found that we did need to have further links and that blocking the central executive didn't interfere with the operation of the buffer per se. That caused us to rethink the way in which working memory is put together, not basically, but to elaborate it somewhat. So we now think of the episodic buffer as sitting above the two other systems, that it feeds into the central executive, but doesn't depend on the central executive for binding, that each of these systems themselves bring together information. So in the case of the visuospatial sketchpad, there are visual features, colour, shape, movement probably, spatial features, what I've called haptic, touch, feel, kinesthesis, motor. The phonological loop, we know that it can process speech, that sign and language and lip reading seems to involve the same system, and we suspect that there will be overlap with both environmental sounds and music, although of course not complete overlap. And we've added the articulatory loop system on here because we think this is perhaps a rather special way of rehearsing information. More generally, we think that rehearsal may go on in the episodic buffer by focusing on, refreshing the representation, drawing in information from the working memory systems, but also from long-term memory in order to make it refreshed. Now, this is still very much a two-dimensional system, and it leaves open where is long-term memory in all this. Well, there are a number of suggestions, and we've gone through several of them. A number of these are, a number of these we've rejected, but just as a way of talking about attempts, This is one attempt where we have long-term memory sitting above everything. But that somehow didn't feel right, because information often comes through long-term memory into these, and this seems to imply that the only way long-term memory can influence anything is through the subsystems, and I'm not sure that that's the case. This is one way of thinking about the relationship with long-term memory. This is a very influential current theory by Nelson Cowan. Nelson talks about working memory as being embedded in long-term memory. He assumes that there are some components that are activated, and of these, the central executive focuses on some. So for Nelson, it's essentially the focus of attention on these activated features of long-term memory. Now, in some ways, people think this is completely different from ours. In fact, both Nelson and myself agree that we agree on most things, but what we're doing is focusing on different things. Nelson is particularly interested in the role of attention and in the way in which attention influences working memory and what influences working memory capacity. We think of Nelson's model as applying to the interaction between the central executive and the episodic buffer, and leaving out these other components. Now, it's not that Nelson denies that these exist. He simply refers to them as activated long-term memory, I think rather as a placeholding of saying, yes, these all involve long-term memory. I'm not so interested in the details of the mechanism. This is what I'm focusing on. So where is long-term memory and where is perception? This is a simple version. So how do you put them together? Well, a slightly more elaborate version of that, drawn by my computer competent friend, is this, which sees everything as going through working memory to long-term memory. Now, some people dislike that, and they argue that perception has to go through long-term memory to get to working memory. I think sometimes it does, but sometimes not. And I prefer not this, but this, which is my simple diagram. So I think of working memory as being linked to the rest of the brain, if you like, which includes long-term memory, semantics, and perception that work together and are interfaced with working memory. And that working memory is then interfaced with action, but I don't want to argue that action can only operate through working memory. Now, at one level, this doesn't tell you very much at all. At another level, it tries to get at the problem that worries lots of people, which is, what's the relationship between working memory and long-term memory? Is working memory just activated long-term memory? And the answer here is that no, it involves activated long-term memory and lots of other things, but it's a separate system that performs a separate but interactive function. So that's the current model.